On the edge of Beaufort, South Carolina, a grand southern estate stood behind iron gates, its windows shuttered, its owner a man the town had not seen smile in years. The November air carried a bite that morning, cool enough to make the old bricks on Main Street glisten faintly with dew. Harrison Cole stepped out of Miss Patty's diner with his leather gloves tucked into one palm, a folded copy of the Beaufort Gazette under his arm. He adjusted the collar of his wool coat as the door swung shut behind him, letting the familiar chime ring out into the street. A few heads turned habit, not curiosity. In a place like Beaufort, even the reclusive were still part of the rhythm. Miss Patty herself had topped off his coffee 3 times without asking the way she always did. The checkered floor had been worn down by decades of footsteps, the counter lined with locals who knew each other's breakfast orders by heart. Harrison's was as predictable as the sunrise: 2 eggs over easy country ham and wheat toast with a side of grits. He always left a 20% tip neatly folded beneath the lip of the saucer, a small act of courtesy that required no conversation. He walked with unhurried steps toward the post office, passing storefronts dressed for the season. Cornhusk wreaths hung on glass doors, ribbons in deep golds and burnt oranges caught the wind. Outside the bakery, a chalkboard announced pecan pie, fresh today. The smell of roasted pecans mingled with cinnamon drifted through the crisp air curling around him, like a whisper from another time. Inside the post office, the scent shifted to paper, and faint glue the place humming with low chatter. Mr. Whitmore was already there. His plaid scarf looped twice around his neck, leaning one elbow on the counter as he chatted with the clerk. His white hair caught the morning light from the high windows, and his voice carried just enough to let those nearby know he had something worth hearing, at least in his own mind. Harrison he greeted, turning with the kind of smile that was more habit than warmth. "Haven't seen you out this early in a while." "I've been keeping to my schedule," Harrison replied evenly, reaching for his P.O. box key. His cufflinks caught the light as he turned them between his fingers, a small unconscious gesture he made when bracing for small talk. Mr. Whitmore leaned in a fraction. "Speaking of schedules, I hear you might be hiring again. Housekeeper, right?" Harrison's glance was brief, considering it. "Well, you know there's a name going around. Loretta Miles. Folks say she's looking for work again. Just thought I'd mention." He lowered his voice conspiratorially, though still loud enough to be heard by the woman stamping envelopes nearby. "She had some trouble at her last job. Things went missing. I'd be careful if I were you." The key turned in Harrison's box with a muted click. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, pulling out a small stack of mail. No more, no less. Back outside, the light had shifted warmer now, touching the tops of the oaks that lined the street. He didn't head straight for the estate. Instead, he took the long way past the marina, where the masts swayed in the breeze, their rigging clinking softly. A fisherman on the dock lifted a hand in greeting. Harrison nodded once in return. The estate rose at the end of a long, curving drive, its red brick darkened by years of southern rain. The iron gates groaned open at the press of a button, and the crunch of gravel under the tires filled the otherwise silent approach. Inside, the air was cooler, the walls holding the night's chill. He shrugged off his coat in the entryway, his eyes drifting toward the closed double doors of the library. That room remained untouched since Evelyn's passing. The photograph on the desk, Evelyn, in a summer dress laughter, caught mid-breath, was the only thing that ever seemed to hold the light. Dust gathered on the spines of the books, though not a speck dared settle on the frame. He stepped inside, running a gloved finger along the edge of the desk before pulling it back. The knock came from the front hall, precise and polite. Abigail Trent stepped in, her gray hair pinned neatly, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. "Morning, Harrison. I brought the Foundation's quarterly reports." They went through the numbers at the dining table, her voice steady as she moved from page to page. He listened, nodding occasionally, but his thoughts drifted. When she paused to take a sip of water, he said almost casually, "You still have that contact at the agency in Charleston?" "I do," she replied. "Why?" "See if they have a file on Loretta Miles. I want to read it." Abigail's brows lifted slightly. "I can have it by tomorrow." That will do. They finished their work, and she gathered her papers, offering a quiet goodbye before letting herself out. Harrison remained at the table a moment longer, the sunlight creeping across the polished wood. He thought of Mr. Whitmore's warning, of the name that had lingered between them like dust in the air. From his study window, Harrison watches the gates swing open for the first time in weeks, a figure approaching up the drive. Harrison lingered by the study window a while longer, watching the iron gates close behind Abigail's car. The estate was still again, the quiet settling in, like a familiar blanket. He stepped back from the glass, moving through the wide hallways at a measured pace, the sound of his own footsteps echoing off the high ceilings. The house had a way of amplifying solitude. Even with the heating system humming faintly, there was a coolness to the air that seemed untouched by any human presence. He passed the dining room without looking in. He hadn't sat at that long table in years, not since Evelyn's last Thanksgiving. The chairs remained perfectly aligned, the crystal glassware still in the cabinet untouched. In the kitchen, Harrison placed the folded Beaufort Gazette on the counter. He reached for the kettle, filling it halfway before setting it on the stove. He preferred coffee at the diner in the morning, but afternoons were for tea, black no sugar the way Evelyn used to make it when she wanted him to slow down. The steam curled upward, fogging the polished copper vent above the stove. After pouring the tea, he carried the cup into the library. The dust caught the light in thin strands as he walked toward the window, careful not to disturb anything on Evelyn's desk. That photograph of her, the one in the summer dress, remained exactly where it had been the day she was gone. Sometimes in the soft light of late afternoon, it felt like she might just step back into the room. A faint buzz from his phone broke the moment. He retrieved it from his coat pocket. Abigail's name lit the screen. "I've got the file you asked for," she said when he answered. "The agency sent it over just now. Want me to bring it by?" "Yes," Harrison replied without hesitation. She arrived less than 20 minutes later, the portfolio under her arm again, but this time slimmer. Harrison gestured her into the study, the scent of tea still hanging in the air. "Here it is," she said, sliding a manila folder across the desk. Loretta Miles started domestic work at 20 mostly private households. One long-term position, 8 years until the family moved overseas. The last one was short, 3 months. She left before the contract was up. Harrison flipped through the neatly typed pages. The agency's notes were sparse, efficient, almost too efficient for his liking. Clean record, references that were polite, if not glowing. There was no mention of the trouble Whitmore had suggested. He studied the attached photograph, Loretta in a simple blouse, her dark hair pulled back, eyes steady on the camera. "She's local," he asked. "Lives about 2 miles from here." "Bus into town most days," Abigail replied. He closed the file but kept his hand on it. "Set up a meeting. Here, tomorrow morning." Abigail nodded, slipping her hands into her coat pockets. "You're serious about this?" "I just want to see for myself," he said the words, even though his mind was already working through the possibility of how to measure her honesty. When she left, Harrison carried the folder back to the library. He placed it on the desk beside Evelyn's photograph and stood there for a long moment. The face in the picture seemed to be watching him, as though waiting for him to make a decision. Outside, the afternoon light began to fade, casting the estate's brick walls in deeper shades of red and brown. The leaves along the driveway rustled in the breeze, the sound reaching him even through the thick window glass. He took a slow sip of tea, feeling the warmth settle in his chest. There was a part of him that wanted to dismiss Whitmore's warning outright. People loved to talk in Beaufort, and truth rarely survived the telling. But another part, the one that had been burned too many times, tightened its grip. Trust was earned, never given freely. He turned from the desk and made his way upstairs, the boards creaking softly underfoot. In the master bedroom, the curtains were drawn halfway, letting in just enough of the late-day sun to paint a narrow path across the bedspread. He sat on the edge of the mattress folder, still in hand, and opened it again. The pages rustled quietly as he reread the employment history, pausing at the short last job. He imagined the circumstances. Was it really her choice to leave? Or was there truth to the whispers? By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Harrison had made up his mind. Tomorrow he would meet Loretta Miles face to face. And if she was going to step foot into his home, she'd face a test she wouldn't see coming. The lamps in Harrison's study glowed with a soft amber light as evening settled in. The estate had a different voice after dark shadows pooling in the corners, the faint groan of timber as the temperature dropped. Harrison moved slowly around the room, collecting a few papers from the desk before tucking them neatly into a drawer. The manila folder with Loretta Miles's file stayed on top, a silent reminder of tomorrow's meeting. He crossed to the liquor cabinet and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon, though he only held the glass, letting the amber swirl catch the lamplight. The drink was more for ritual than for comfort. He took a seat by the window, gazing out into the black outline of the oak trees against the fading sky. Evelyn's face drifted into his thoughts, again uninvited, but not unwelcome. He remembered the way she would stand on the front porch with a dish towel over her shoulder, waving at neighbors as they walked their dogs. She had trusted easily, maybe too easily at least. That's what he'd thought back then. But it was her openness that had built bridges in this town, even with people who'd judged them in whispers behind closed doors. He set the bourbon down untouched. The room felt colder, and he rose to stir the fire in the hearth. As the flames caught their light, flickered across the bookshelves, pulling faint glints from the gold-embossed titles. Harrison crouched for a moment, watching the logs shift and crackle before returning to his desk. The test formed itself in his mind with the kind of precision he applied to business deals in his younger days. There would be no warning for Loretta, no opportunity to prepare a facade. He wanted to see the truth of her character without the polish of performance. A careless oversight that was the scenario he'd create. Something tempting enough to challenge her principles, but subtle enough to seem accidental. He pictured the east wing rarely used these days. The heavy door to the safe room, the click of the lock, the rows of neat stacks inside. It wouldn't take much to make it look as though he'd forgotten to close it properly. Leave the door ajar, perhaps even a slip of paper with the code in plain sight. Then step back out of view and watch. The thought brought a mix of anticipation and discomfort. Part of him recoiled at the idea of treating another person like a suspect, but experience had taught him harsh lessons. Trust had cost him dearly before. Evelyn's voice seemed to whisper from memory. If you're going to invite someone into your home, make sure they deserve the key. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, the sound deep and resonant. Harrison set the empty glass on the desk and moved to the coat rack, retrieving his wool overcoat. He stepped out into the brisk night air, taking the stone path toward the edge of the property. The iron gates loomed ahead, their black silhouettes stark against the pale glow of the street lamp just beyond. He leaned on the cool metal for a moment, looking down the quiet road. Beaufort was settling in for the night porch lights, on curtains drawn the faint sound of a television drifting from a nearby house. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves. Back inside, he made one last circuit of the ground floor, ensuring the windows were latched and the doors secured. Habit born from years of vigilance. In the library, he paused once more at Evelyn's photograph, the corner of his mouth tightening in something that might have been a smile if it had gone a little further. Upstairs, the master bedroom was neatly turned down. He placed the folder on the nightstand, the lamplight washing over the plain manila cover. Lying back against the pillows, he thought about tomorrow, about the woman he'd only seen in a photograph, and the questions he needed answered. Sleep came slowly, broken by brief stretches of wakefulness. Around midnight, he rose to pour himself a glass of water, standing at the window in the dark. The moon lit the drive, faintly silvering the gravel. He imagined the sound of footsteps on that path, steady and unhurried, the figure of Loretta Miles walking toward the house. From his study window, Harrison watches the gate swing open for the first time in weeks, a figure approaching up the drive. Loretta Miles stepped into the sitting room without glancing around in awe, as if she understood that respect sometimes meant keeping your eyes where they belonged. The light through the tall windows pooled across the hardwood, catching the soft sheen of lemon polish in long, pale streaks. Outside, the wind moved through the oaks, shaking a few stubborn golden leaves loose, sending them spiraling past the glass. Loretta stood just inside the threshold. her back straight, her hands resting loosely in front of her, as if she'd been in rooms like this before and knew the quiet rules that governed them. Harrison was watching her from the far side of the room, one elbow resting on the mantel, his gaze steady but unreadable. Between them, Abigail Trent lingered near the doorway, the subtle smile of someone confident in their role as bridge between two very different worlds. "Miss Miles," Abigail said, breaking the stillness. "This is Mr. Cole." Loretta met his eyes, briefly offered a polite nod. "Mr. Cole." Her voice carried a gentle southern drawl, measured and warm without tipping into familiarity. Harrison didn't return the greeting right away. Instead, he studied the line of her shoulders, the way her chin held level, not lowered in deference, not lifted in defiance. She was dressed in a neat navy blouse and dark slacks, a single silver watch her only accessory. No jangling bracelets, no bright scarves, nothing to catch on the polished edges of his furniture. He gestured toward one of the high-backed chairs opposite him. "Please." She crossed the rug with an easy, even stride, her shoes making no sound on the thick weave. When she sat, it was with the kind of posture that suggested she would remain exactly where he wanted her until dismissed. "Have you worked in historic homes before?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said without hesitation. "A few in Charleston, also one in Savannah, but that was quite a while ago." Abigail watched from the corner, her eyes flicking between them like a tennis match. Harrison's next question came after a measured pause. "You're comfortable with a strict schedule, tasks prioritized daily?" "I prefer it," Loretta answered. "It helps me know what's expected." There was no fidgeting, no attempt to fill the silences he left. She simply waited, hands still folded neatly in her lap. He asked about her approach to maintaining wood floors, her method for polishing silver, whether she handled laundry in-house or preferred sending it out. Each answer was precise, free of embellishment. Then she surprised him. Regarding the library, she said, her tone unchanged. "Would you like me to dust the shelves only, or also arrange the books by height?" He stilled. Most applicants asked about days off, whether meals were provided, or if they could have personal deliveries brought to the gate. None had ever asked something so specific, so clearly attuned to boundaries. "Just dust," he said at last. "Everything stays exactly as it is." She nodded once, as if committing the instruction to memory, and pulled a small, well-worn notebook from her bag to jot it down. The pen moved quickly, then disappeared as smoothly as it had appeared. Abigail spoke up. "If all goes well, Miss Miles can start tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. "That's fine," Loretta said. Harrison leaned back slightly, his eyes lowering to her hands. Years of overseeing crews had taught him to read people from their hands, the calluses of a worker, the restless twitch of someone unreliable. Hers were steady nails, trimmed skin, showing the faint dryness of someone accustomed to work and cleaning products. "Any questions for me?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "Not at this time. I prefer to learn as I go." He watched her rise, smooth her blouse, and turn toward the doorway. Abigail led her through the front hall, past the closed double doors to the east wing. Harrison saw Loretta's eyes flick toward them, just for a moment, but she didn't slow her step. He followed at a distance, stopping in the open doorway as she descended the front steps. The sun caught the side of her face, and for a moment he could see the calm written there, not forced, but lived in. She moved down the drive with the same steady stride she'd used to enter. The gates swung open at Abigail's signal, and Loretta walked through without glancing back. Harrison remained in the doorway, watching until she was a small figure against the bright stretch of road. Inside, the air seemed different, less still, though he couldn't have said why. He closed the door and stood with one hand on the knob for a long beat before turning toward the back of the house. Loretta paused near the doorframe as Abigail adjusted her scarf, almost as if waiting for some unspoken dismissal. Harrison remained in the sitting room, leaning a hand against the back of the chair she'd just vacated. "You've been in housekeeping a long time," he said, his voice carrying easily across the polished floor. "Yes, sir," she replied, turning slightly toward him. "What made you leave your last position?" There was the faintest pause before she answered, not long enough to suggest hesitation, but just enough to show she weighed her words. "It just wasn't the right fit," she said evenly. No excuses, no defensive note, nothing for him to probe. He gave a small nod, his eyes narrowing just slightly. I see. Abigail smoothed the strap of her bag. Mr. Cole likes things done a certain way. I've already given Miss Miles a general outline of his preferences. That's helpful, Loretta said. I've learned that understanding a person's expectations makes the work smoother. Her voice was calm, but Harrison caught the underlying firmness. She wasn't trying to ingratiate herself with syrupy praise, just stating a fact she seemed to live by. Abigail handed over a slim folder with the schedule she'd prepared. 8 a.m. Wednesday morning, she said. You'll sign in with me first, then I'll show you to your workspace. I'll be here, Loretta assured her. The conversation wound down, but Harrison's gaze lingered on her. There was something about the way she kept her shoulders back, her attention anchored without wandering to the high ceilings or antique furniture. He'd seen applicants try to hide their curiosity before their eyes darting over every valuable surface. Loretta didn't bother pretending, she simply seemed uninterested in anything beyond the people she was speaking to. Abigail walked her toward the front door, Harrison trailing a few paces behind. As they passed the east wing, the tall double doors stood closed, the brass handles gleaming faintly in the filtered sunlight. He watched for it, the momentary glance. Loretta's eyes flicked toward the doors just once, almost in passing, before settling straight ahead again. Not the prolonged look of someone imagining what might be behind them, but not total disinterest either. At the threshold, she turned to Abigail. Thank you for arranging this. We'll see you tomorrow, Abigail replied warmly. Mr. Cole, Loretta said, with a small nod in his direction. He inclined his head in return, saying nothing. The front steps creaked softly under her shoes as she descended her stride unhurried. Harrison stood in the doorway as the sun slid lower, lighting her from behind. There was a self-possession about her movements that tugged at his curiosity, though he kept his face impassive. The gates opened at Abigail's signal, and Loretta slipped through without looking back, the late autumn wind lifting the ends of her hair. Harrison followed them with his eyes until she disappeared past the curve of the road. Inside, the air felt heavier again. He walked toward the study, the sound of the door clicking shut behind him, echoing faintly through the hall. The folder Abigail had given her sat on the entry table. Harrison picked it up and leafed through the crisp pages. Every line was tidy, deliberate, just like the woman who'd stood in his sitting room. He set the folder down and crossed to the liquor cabinet, though instead of pouring a drink, he ran his fingertips over the polished wood. The idea had already begun to take shape in his mind, sharp and clear. A test not of skill, anyone could polish silver or dust shelves, but of integrity. If she was as steady as she seemed, the test would prove it, and if not, well, better to know early. When the gates closed behind Loretta, Harrison stood in the front hall for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the heating system and the wind against the windows. The house felt large again, too large, and the sound of his own footsteps was the only thing breaking the stillness as he moved toward the back of the estate. He passed the library without pausing the familiar tug of memory at its closed door and continued into the east wing. The double doors there were taller, heavier, their polished brass handles cool to the touch. He drew a key from his pocket and slid it into the lock, the tumblers clicking into place with a satisfying weight. Inside, the air was different, cooler, almost untouched. A faint scent of cedar hung in the space preserved by the lack of daily intrusion. Against the far wall stood the safe, an imposing block of steel with a finish so smooth it reflected the dim overhead light. Harrison approached it, his eyes moving over the keypad, the small hinge at the side. He entered the code with deliberate slowness, each beep echoing faintly off the walls. The mechanism released with a low muted thud, and the door swung outward. Rows of neatly stacked bills, gold coins in velvet-lined trays, and a few slender boxes containing heirloom jewelry gleamed under the pale light. Property deeds lay in a thin pile beside them, the paper edges perfectly aligned. Harrison rested one hand against the edge of the door. Tomorrow, it would not be shut. The arrangement would look almost careless in oversight from a man too distracted to notice. He would leave the heavy door ajar, the valuables within easy reach, and a small slip of paper with the code in plain sight on the table. He straightened, studying the safe from a few paces back, imagining the scene as someone else might see it. The test would be simple in design, but sharp in its verdict. Over the years, he had seen people fail such moments without hesitation. It was in those private, unobserved decisions that truth revealed itself. Stepping back into the hallway, he closed the safe door, for now the latch engaging with a muted finality. His fingers lingered briefly on the cool steel before he turned the key in the lock, pocketing it once again. The east wing hallway was quiet as he moved through it, the fading afternoon light spilling in from the high windows and casting long shadows across the floor. He paused near the double doors, letting his hand rest on the frame, his mind already reaching toward tomorrow morning. In the study, he leaned against the doorframe, looking out toward the front drive. As the last of the day's light settled over the oaks, the air was still the estate in that liminal hour between day and night. He could almost hear the faint creak of the safe's hinge in his mind, the sound marking the opening move in a private game only he and the newcomer would be playing. The sound of the safe's hinge echoes in the quiet, and Harrison leans against the doorframe, already picturing tomorrow. By mid-morning, Loretta had polished the silver, dusted the library, and made her way toward the east wing, where the safe door gaped open like an unspoken dare. The morning had been calm until then, marked by the quiet rhythm of her work and the occasional creak of the house settling. She'd started in the dining room, the polish bringing a mirror's shine to the cutlery, the weight of each piece familiar in her hands. In the library, she'd moved carefully along the shelves, her duster gliding over the spines without shifting a single book from its place. The scent of lemon oil lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the older scent of paper and leather-bound volumes. Now stepping into the east wing hallway, she noticed the light slanting in from the tall windows, catching motes of dust in the air. Her pace was unhurried, but something about the hush here felt different, like stepping into a room where someone had just left. The faint ticking of a clock somewhere nearby marked the seconds. In the kitchen earlier, she had taken a short break, setting her duster on the counter while the kettle came to a boil. The warmth of the tea had been welcome against the cool morning air, the mug resting lightly between her palms. That was when her phone had rung, her mother's number flashing on the screen. "Hey, Mama," she'd greeted, her tone softening instantly. "Loretta," Martha's voice had been low, tired. "I don't like to worry you, but the bakery." Loretta had straightened in her chair. "What about it?" "They're saying if we don't cover the back rent and the power bill by Friday, they'll close us down. And your Uncle Harold called, says the hospital sent another letter about my surgery. The balance is, it's more than we thought." Her mother's voice cracked on the last words, and Loretta had gripped the edge of the counter. "How much, Mama?" There was a pause before the answer came. 38,000 by the end of the week. Loretta had pressed a hand to her forehead, willing her voice to stay steady. "I'll find a way. Baby, I didn't call to—" "I'll find a way," she'd repeated, firm this time. They'd said goodbye quietly, her mother's voice soft with gratitude. Loretta had stayed in the kitchen a moment longer, staring into the steam rising from her mug, before finishing the tea in a few slow swallows. Then she'd picked up her duster and gone back to work, though her mind had been running in tight, anxious circles ever since. And now the open door at the far end of the hall stopped her. The heavy steel safe loomed inside its door, swung wide to reveal neatly stacked bills, the crisp edges aligned perfectly. Gold coins gleamed in their velvet trays, catching the light from the single ceiling lamp. An envelope, its flap unsealed, lay near the front, the corner of a property deed just visible inside. Her breathing quickened before she realized it. The duster felt heavier in her hand, her fingers tightening around the handle. She stepped forward, drawn almost unwillingly toward the open vault. The faint scent of metal and paper hung in the air, clean and cold. Somewhere else in the house, unseen, a clock ticked on the sound, unnervingly loud in the stillness. Loretta stood in the doorway of the safe room, her pulse loud in her ears. The air felt heavier here, close and still, the muted glow from the single ceiling lamp making the stacks of bills seem almost unreal. Her jaw tightened, a habit she'd had since childhood, whenever she was forcing herself to think before acting. She took one careful step forward, the edge of the rug in the hallway, brushing her ankle as she moved into the room. The safe's open mouth seemed to breathe temptation, each neat row of bills an unspoken offer. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to hear footsteps, but the hallway remained empty. The faint ticking of the hall clock reached her ear, steady and indifferent. In the surveillance room, Harrison sat in his leather chair, leaning slightly toward the monitor that showed her in sharp detail. His hand rested on the desk. The fingers curled loosely, but his eyes were sharp. The memory of Mr. Whitmore's voice came back to him. She had trouble at her last job. Things went missing, the words replaying with a faint edge of warning. On the screen, Loretta moved a fraction closer to the safe, her gaze taking in the gold coins, the gleam of metal catching the light against the dark velvet lining. Her hands, he noticed, remained steady. No twitch, no fumble, just that tight grip on the duster. She stopped within arm's reach of the door, her breathing changing, more deliberate now. Images tumbled in her mind without invitation. Her mother's tired voice, the bakery's darkened windows, the bills piling up. She could see herself taking just enough, one neat bundle, tucking it away in her bag, promising she'd pay it back once things got better. The thought hit her hard, quickening her breath, and she shut her eyes for a moment as if to block the image out. When she opened them again, the safe was still there, patient and open, waiting. In the dim light of the surveillance room, Harrison's expression didn't change, but his eyes tracked every movement. He'd run this test before different people, different circumstances, and most hadn't passed. People showed themselves when they thought no one was watching. Loretta's shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. She glanced at the slip of paper lying on the table beside the safe, the digits written in neat, deliberate hand. She didn't reach for the money. Instead, she let the duster hang loosely at her side, her other hand curling into a fist before slowly unclenching. The urge to step back warred with the pull to take another step forward. She imagined how quickly $38,000 could change the trajectory of this week, this month, maybe even the rest of the year. But just as quickly, another image surfaced, her father's voice years ago telling her that the only thing a person truly owned was their name. Once you lost that, it was gone for good. She exhaled again, slower this time, eyes still on the open safe, the golden paper gleaming under that cold lamp. Loretta let the silence press in around her for a long moment before she moved. Her eyes settled on the slip of paper lying beside the open door, the neat columns of numbers staring back at her. It would be so easy, memorize the digits, take what she needed, slip the door shut, and no one would be the wiser. Her hand trembled as she reached toward the table. She could almost feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. She picked up the slip, the paper thin and warm against her palm from the heat of the lamp above. For a second, she simply held it there, breathing through the tightness in her chest. In the surveillance room, Harrison leaned forward, the glow of the monitor painting his face in cool light. His eyes narrowed, watching the way her fingers closed around the paper. He could hear in his mind the metallic creak the hinges would make if she pulled the door wider. He waited for it, but instead Loretta stepped closer to the keypad. She didn't even glance back at the stacks of cash or the gleaming coins. She stared at the keys for a beat, then began pressing them, deliberate, steady, but not in the order written on the slip. Random numbers, each beep a small act of defiance against the temptation gnawing at her. The safe gave a dull click, the mechanism locking into place. The door settled shut with a muted thud. Loretta exhaled a sound somewhere between relief and exhaustion and slid the folded paper into the pocket of her blouse. She stepped back, looking at the sealed door as though to make sure it would stay that way. Her hands loosened their grip on the duster. She moved to a nearby chair and sat down, her knees feeling unsteady. For a long while, she didn't do anything. Just sat there, elbows resting on her thighs, staring at the closed safe. Her mind was still loud with what-ifs and the echo of her mother's voice, but there was a strange lightness beginning to creep in. It wasn't happiness exactly, more like the absence of a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying until it lifted. In the dim quiet of the surveillance room, Harrison didn't move right away. The image of her pressing a random sequence of locking the safe instead of taking from it replayed in his mind. He'd seen hesitation before, but not like that, not a decision made in full view of need and desperation. yet turned toward Principal anyway. His eyes narrowed in surprise as the lock clicked into place, the small sound echoing in the otherwise still house. He sat back in his chair slowly, his gaze never leaving the screen. Loretta sat in a straight-backed chair, facing the locked safe, her hands clasped neatly in her lap, as if guarding a treasure that wasn't hers to keep. The hallway was quiet except for the steady ticking of the clock down the corridor. Afternoon sunlight poured in through the high windows at a low angle, stretching long shadows across the polished wood floor. The lemon polish she'd used earlier still lingered faintly in the air, its brightness oddly at odds with the heaviness in her chest. She had been there for nearly an hour, already unmoving except to adjust her posture. Her eyes stayed on the safe, the gleam of the steel now muted by the shifting light. She wasn't sure if she expected someone to come by or if she was simply holding herself there to make sure nothing did happen. In the surveillance room, Harrison leaned back in his chair, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. The glow from the monitors reflected faintly in his eyes as he watched her still figure. Evelyn's voice floated up from memory, unbidden yet clear. You can tell a person's worth by what they do when no one's looking. He reached over to replay an earlier segment, the moment she had walked past the safe before returning to stand in the doorway. There had been no darting glance, no furtive movements, just that momentary pause, followed by the deliberate act of sealing the door. He compared it now to the motionless silhouette on the screen and felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected: admiration, though it was tangled with his habitual skepticism. The shrill ring of a phone broke the stillness in the hallway feed. Loretta reached into her pocket, glanced at the screen, and answered softly. "Hey, Auntie." A young voice came through, tinged with worry. "Mama told me about the bakery. Is it true they might shut it down?" "It's true," Loretta said quietly, her gaze never leaving the safe. There was a pause on the other end. "What will we do?" Loretta took a slow breath. "We'll figure it out, baby. I promise you we'll find a way." "You always say that, and I've never broken that promise, have I?" she said with a softness that steadied the young voice before they said goodbye. When the call ended, she slid the phone back into her pocket and folded her hands again, her expression unreadable. Back in the surveillance room, Harrison rubbed a hand over his jaw. The conversation had been brief, but the tone in her voice carried something heavier than her calm exterior revealed. He remembered Mr. Whitmore's insinuations, the casual poison in his words, and found himself wondering just how much of it was based on anything real. The feed flickered briefly as Abigail stepped into frame, walking slowly down the hallway. She stopped a few feet from Loretta, her brow knitting in quiet curiosity. "You've been here a while," Abigail remarked. "Just making sure nothing happens," Loretta replied. Abigail's lips curved into a small, surprised smile. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone sit so still for so long." Loretta only shrugged lightly. "Stillness isn't so hard when you know why you're here." Abigail lingered a moment longer before heading back the way she came, her shoes tapping softly against the wood. The church bells from town began to toll in the distance, their sound muffled but distinct. Outside, the light had shifted to a deeper gold shadows reaching further into the hallway. Loretta adjusted her seat just enough to ease the stiffness in her back, then folded her hands again. In the surveillance room, Harrison's coffee sat untouched, its steam long gone. He didn't take his eyes from the feed. The hours began to fold in on themselves, each minute stretching longer than it had any right to. The afternoon light thinned, softening from gold to a pale, almost silver wash. It pooled weakly on the floorboards before retreating toward the baseboards, letting the shadows claim more of the hallway. The polished wood reflected those shadows in muted tones, as though the house itself was dimming with the day. Loretta shifted once, just enough to cross one ankle over the other, her back still straight against the chair. Her hands remained loosely clasped in her lap. Every so often she adjusted her fingers, not out of restlessness, but to keep them from going numb. She didn't hum, didn't sigh, didn't tap her shoe. The stillness had settled on her like a second skin. In the surveillance room, Harrison sat with his elbows braced on the desk, the glow of the monitors throwing sharp light across his face. He tapped a key and brought up the footage from earlier in the day again. The image of Loretta walking past the open safe appeared on the left monitor, while the right monitor showed her current motionless form. He played both feeds, at once on one side the decisive movements of locking the safe, on the other, the quiet vigil in the hallway. It wasn't lost on him how rare this was. In the past, people he'd tested lasted minutes, maybe a quarter of an hour, before finding a reason to leave the temptation behind. But she had stayed. Not because she needed to, there was no way she could know he was watching, but because she had chosen to. Still, suspicion was a stubborn habit. He remembered the easy confidence with which Mr. Whitmore had spread his rumor over the post office counter, leaning in as if confiding a truth. Harrison had lived long enough to know how small towns could magnify a lie until it replaced fact. He also knew better than to take people at face value, no matter how steady they appeared. He switched the right monitor to a closer view from a different angle, the camera positioned further down the hallway. This perspective caught the set of her jaw, the way her gaze stayed fixed on the safe. He noticed the faint crease between her brows, the kind that came from focus, not frustration. The grandfather clock in the far hall began its slow, deliberate ticking toward the next hour. Each talk was soft but distinct, threading itself through the feed's quiet. In the space between the clock's rhythm and the faint hum of the surveillance equipment, Harrison became aware of his own breathing. On the screen, Loretta adjusted again, leaning forward slightly, her elbows resting just above her knees. She rubbed her palms together once briskly to warm them, then clasped them again. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the branches of the oaks against the high windows, their bare limbs scratching faintly against the glass. Harrison replayed this moment Abigail had approached earlier. The older woman's surprise had been genuine. She'd paused, almost puzzled, as if she couldn't quite place why someone would commit themselves so thoroughly to watching over something that wasn't theirs. He let the scene run twice before returning to the live feed. By now, the hall outside the safe room was steeped in shadows. Only a narrow band of muted light cut across the floor from one of the tall windows, catching the curve of Loretta's shoe and the lower hem of her slacks. The rest of her was outlined in the cool wash of the ceiling lamp spilling from the safe room. She hadn't spoken since the call from her niece. Whatever thoughts were passing through her mind, they stayed locked behind her composed expression. Occasionally, she blinked slowly, the sort of blink one makes to ease tired eyes, but her gaze never wandered far from the safe's steel face. Harrison leaned back, finally reaching for his coffee, though the sip he took was cold and bitter. He set the mug down with a quiet click against the desk and rested his chin on his hand. He couldn't deny that her endurance was beginning to shift something in him. He told himself it was just data, another piece of evidence to file away before reaching a verdict. But somewhere under that reasoning, he felt the first hint of a loosening in the wall he'd built. Another 10 minutes passed. The bells from the church in town rang faintly again, 5:30 now. Outside, the world was sliding into early evening, the kind that came quickly in late November. The last of the daylight gave the glass panes a dull sheen before slipping away entirely, leaving the east wing in deep shadow, except for that one pool of light from the safe room. Loretta's breathing was steady, but her body language had shifted slightly. Her shoulders drawn in just a fraction, the kind of posture change that came from hours of stillness. She rolled her neck once, a small motion, and resettled into her seat. Harrison watched that adjustment closely. There was no trace of impatience in it, no quick glances toward the end of the hall, as if searching for an excuse to leave. She simply returned to her vigil, as if nothing else in the house required her attention more than guarding what was behind that steel door. The clock in the hall ticked on its rhythm, now the loudest sound in either of their worlds. The light outside was nearly gone when the grandfather clock began its slow wind-up toward the hour. Each gear inside seemed to groan in deliberate preparation, the sound faint but distinct through the quiet halls. Loretta shifted only slightly in her chair, enough to straighten her back and uncross her ankles. Her gaze remained fixed on the locked safe, though her eyes caught the faint reflection of the ceiling lamp in its smooth steel face. The air had cooled. She could feel it in her fingers, and in the steady, shallow breaths she drew to keep her chest calm. In the surveillance room, Harrison's eyes moved between the live feed and the wall clock above his desk. The time had slipped past more quickly for him then for her watching wasn't the same as waiting. But he knew she had endured hours that could stretch a person thin. He thought again of Evelyn's words. You can tell a person's worth by what they do when no one's looking. The memory came with the image of Evelyn standing in their old kitchen flour, dusting her hands as she shaped a pie crust, speaking with that easy certainty that made him believe she was right about everything. The clock on the wall struck 6. The chime was deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to fill the quiet space between them even though they were in separate parts of the house. Harrison set down his now empty coffee mug, pushed back his chair, and stood. His knees made the faintest protest after sitting for so long. He smoothed his jacket with both hands, a habit born of years of public dealings, and took a breath. The test was over. Whatever judgment he would form, he'd seen enough. He crossed the surveillance room and stepped into the hall, the carpet muffling the first few steps before he reached the polished wood of the east wing corridor. The temperature there was cooler, the kind of chill that came from a long day without much movement or sun. His shoes clicked softly at first, then more firmly, as he found his rhythm measured, deliberate, not rushed. Loretta heard the sound before she saw him. The faint echo of footsteps reached her from the far end of the hall, each one spaced with the confidence of someone who belonged in every room of the house. She didn't turn her head right away. She kept her gaze on the safe, as if the sound of his approach was part of the house's natural rhythm. Harrison's pace was steady. He passed the first tall window, its glass now a black mirror to the interior light. The faint scent of lemon polish lingered here the same as in the rest of the house, but beneath it was something cooler night air that had found its way in through old brick and wood. Loretta finally looked up when the sound of his steps drew closer, but she didn't rise from her chair. Her hands remained folded, her posture still straight despite the hours she'd been there. Harrison slowed as he came within a few paces, the shadows in the hallway wrapping around his frame before the light from the safe room caught his face. His expression was unreadable, neither stern nor warm, though there was a focus in his eyes that made it clear this was no casual stroll. The grandfather clock's final chime faded into silence, leaving only the sound of his steps as they echoed once, twice more. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, measured, deliberate, drawing closer to Loretta. "You're still here," Harrison said, his voice softer than Loretta had ever heard. The words settled in the hallway like a shift in the air. Loretta rose from the chair, unfolding herself from the posture she had held for hours. Her legs felt heavy, but her spine stayed straight as she turned fully toward him. The light from the safe room caught her face, revealing the faint shadows under her eyes. "I noticed the safe was open," she said simply, "so I called Abigail. I thought it best to stay here until someone came to secure it." Harrison took a few more measured steps forward, the soles of his shoes clicking softly against the wood. "I know." Her brows drew together slightly. "You know, I watched the whole thing," he said, his voice even, but without the coldness she might have expected. "There are cameras throughout the house." For a heartbeat, the hallway was silent, except for the distant tick of the grandfather clock. Loretta's gaze didn't waver. "This is your home, Mr. Cole. You have the right to protect it however you see fit." Harrison studied her, the calm in her voice matched by the steadiness in her posture. In the doorway behind him, Abigail appeared, her presence quiet, almost hesitant. She didn't speak, only leaned lightly against the frame, eyes flicking between the two of them. Without breaking eye contact with Loretta, Harrison gestured toward the far end of the hall. "Come with me." They walked side by side to his study, the door swinging inward to reveal the warm glow of lamplight pooling across the desk. The bourbon decanter sat on one corner, its stopper in place, the glasses beside it untouched. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, a contrast to the soft gold of the desk lamp. Harrison moved behind the desk and opened the top drawer. From it he withdrew a sealed envelope and held it out to her. "This is yours." Loretta hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing the heavy paper. She opened the flap and slid out a check. 50,000 written neatly in his hand. She looked back up at him, her voice steady. "I can't accept this. It's not charity," he said. "It's earned." She shook her head, sliding the check back toward him across the polished desk. Doing what's right doesn't need a reward. I did what anyone should have done. From the doorway, Abigail's brow lifted slightly, but she said nothing. Harrison's eyes lingered on Loretta's face, as if weighing whether to push the matter. "You're not like most people," he said finally. Loretta's gaze softened, but there was no trace of self-congratulation in it. "Years ago, my niece needed surgery, life-saving surgery we couldn't afford. An anonymous donor paid the hospital bill in full. We never knew who it was." She paused, her eyes dropping briefly to the edge of his desk before meeting his again. "When I applied here, I saw the name of the foundation on the paperwork. I recognized it from the hospital's donor list. That was you. And Evelyn." Harrison's breath caught for a moment at the sound of Evelyn's name spoken aloud in this room. The memory was sudden and vivid. He and Evelyn, seated together at this very desk, her hand resting lightly over his as he signed the check. She'd smiled at him afterward, not the bright social smile she wore in public, but the one that belonged only to him, the one that told him she believed they were doing something good that mattered. Loretta's voice broke into the memory, quiet but sure. "I came here to work, Mr. Cole, to serve, not to take." The weight of her words settled between them, and for the first time in years, Harrison felt the rigid lines of suspicion inside him begin to give way. Harrison's fingers lingered on the edge of the check after she pushed it back across the desk. He didn't pick it up right away, just rested his palm over it as though the paper itself carried a weight heavier than the sum of its numbers. Her words about Evelyn, about the hospital, had landed somewhere deep in him, stirring dust from corners he hadn't stepped into in years. "I remember that day," he said quietly. His eyes weren't on her now. They had drifted past her shoulder to a point far beyond the study walls. The letter came from the hospital urgent with a list of names and needs. Evelyn. She didn't even let me finish reading it before she started talking about how we could help. The image was so clear in his mind, it almost made his throat tighten. Evelyn sitting in the chair opposite him, her hair pulled back, wearing one of her soft cardigans. She had crossed the room to stand behind him, her hand finding his shoulder as she looked over the paper with him. "It's not about the money, Harrison," she had said that day, her voice low but steady. "It's about doing what you can in the moment you're asked. That's when it matters." He could still feel the slight pressure of her hand as he signed the check, the way she'd leaned down to kiss the top of his head after he'd set the pen aside. They hadn't known the family. They hadn't needed to. He drew a slow breath and brought his gaze back to Loretta. "You were on the other end of that gift." "My niece was," Loretta corrected gently. "But we all felt it. She's 21 now in school. She wouldn't be here without that surgery." The admission carried no plea, no bargaining, just fact. She stood with her weight evenly balanced, tired but unbowed, her hands resting loosely at her sides. Harrison studied her for a long moment. The hours she'd spent in that chair, guarding what wasn't hers, the quiet refusal of his check, the absence of bitterness in her voice, all of it was pressing against the walls he'd built around his trust. From the doorway, Abigail's eyes softened as she watched. She'd been in this house long enough to see plenty of people come and go, most leaving with some part of Harrison's distrust trailing after them. This felt different. "I thought I'd stop believing in people," Harrison said, finally the admission sounding strange even to his own ears. "And maybe I had, but you." He let the sentence hang unfinished, as though putting it into words might make it too vulnerable. Loretta's mouth curved just enough to suggest a smile, though it was touched with fatigue. "Belief doesn't have to come all at once. Sometimes it's built in pieces." The quiet between them was steady, not strained. The study's lamplight wrapped the scene in a soft glow, as though the room itself had leaned closer to listen. Outside, the wind pushed gently against the windows, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. Harrison's gaze dropped to the check again, before he slid it into the drawer and closed it with a quiet click. "You didn't come here for money. You came here with a purpose." "I did," Loretta said. "And I'll keep showing up as long as you'll have me." Harrison stood behind the desk for a long moment after Loretta's words faded into the quiet. His gaze moved slowly over her face, tracing the calm lines there, the steadiness that seemed untouched by the day's strain. Then, almost as if deciding something in the space of a breath, he turned to the set of drawers on the right side of his desk. The brass handles were polished smooth from years of use, and he knew exactly which one he was reaching for. The drawer slid open with a soft rasp, revealing a leather-bound folder resting neatly on top of several stacked files. The leather was deep brown, its surface worn smooth in places, the corners faintly creased. He hadn't touched it in years, not since Evelyn's passing. He laid his hand on the cover for a moment, feeling the faint give of the material beneath his palm, before lifting it free. The weight of it was familiar, heavier than the paper inside should have made it. Loretta's eyes followed the movement, but she didn't speak. She simply watched as he set the folder on the desk between them and rested his fingertips lightly on its edge. "This," he said, his voice quiet but deliberate, "is the Winters Trust Foundation portfolio. Evelyn and I built it together to support causes we believed in quietly, without ceremony. I've kept it locked away because I couldn't find anyone I trusted enough to lead it." He pushed the folder toward her. "Until now." Loretta glanced down at the leather cover, then back at him. "Mr. Cole," I think he continued, a faint curve touching the corner of his mouth. "I've been waiting for you for a long time." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The lamplight pooled warmly over the desk, touching the folder between them like it was the axis around which the moment turned. In the doorway, Abigail straightened slightly, her eyes widening just a fraction, but she still didn't speak. Loretta reached out her fingertips, brushing the cool leather. She didn't open it yet, just let her hand rest there, as if acknowledging the weight of what had just been placed in front of her. Harrison leaned back in his chair, watching her with a steadiness that felt different from the guarded scrutiny of earlier. There was still caution in his gaze, but it had softened into something that looked a great deal like trust. "I think I've been waiting for you for a long time," he said again, his tone low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. For the first time in years, the long dining table gleamed under a chandelier's light set for more than one plate. The polished mahogany reflected the warm glow above the silverware laid in perfect alignment beside crisp white china. At the center, a roast turkey rested on a platter, its golden skin gleaming, surrounded by sprigs of rosemary. A basket of cornbread sat nearby, the yellow folds wrapped in a linen napkin. Steam curled from a bowl of collard greens, their deep green leaves glistening, while a pecan pie cooled on the sideboard, its rich, sugary scent mingling with the aroma of the feast. Harrison stood at one end of the table, adjusting the angle of a candlestick just slightly. The flickering flame caught in the hurricane glass, sending a ripple of light across the tablecloth. He stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the setting, with a quiet satisfaction that felt almost foreign after so many years of keeping this room closed. From the hallway came the sound of footsteps and voices. Abigail's warm alto, Loretta's gentler tone, and another voice he recognized instantly, Martha Miles, speaking with the slight huskiness of someone still recovering strength. She entered leaning on Loretta's arm, her face framed by soft curls of gray hair. "Well, my goodness," Martha said, pausing in the doorway. "This is something to see." "It's been a long time," Harrison replied, offering her a small, genuine smile. The doorbell chimed, and Abigail moved to answer it. A moment later, Mr. Whitmore stepped in, his hat in hand, looking as though he'd rehearsed what he was going to say a dozen times and still wasn't sure it would come out right. "Evening, Mr. Cole." He began, his voice carrying that cautious tone people use when they're not sure of their welcome. He turned to Loretta. "Miss Miles, I owe you an apology. For the things I said before, I didn't have the right." Loretta's expression was open, her voice steady. "We all have room to learn, Mr. Whitmore. Thank you for saying so." He gave a quick nod, relief flickering in his eyes before he moved to hang up his coat. As the guests found their seats, the hum of conversation began to fill the air. The chairs scraped lightly against the floor, silverware chimed softly as people settled in. It was a simple sound, but to Harrison it felt monumental. This was the first time in years that the dining room had heard anything beyond the whisper of dust and the occasional creak of its old floorboards. When everyone was seated, Harrison remained standing, resting one hand lightly on the back of his chair. His gaze swept the table, taking in the faces, familiar and new, and he felt the weight of the moment settle comfortably on his shoulders. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. He began, his voice warm, carrying easily over the table. This house, it hasn't seen much company in a long time, but it feels right that it should, especially tonight. He paused, his eyes briefly meeting Loretta's. I'd like to make a toast to Evelyn, whose kindness still guides this house, and to those who remind us that faith in people can be restored. He lifted his glass, the amber liquid catching the candlelight. Around the table, glasses were raised in unison, the crystal chiming lightly as they touched. The first bite of turkey was met with murmurs of approval. Laughter rising as stories began to flow, some about small-town quirks, others about shared memories. For the first time in a long while, Harrison didn't feel the need to keep one ear tuned for trouble. The room was alive, and the warmth in it was not from the chandelier alone. From her seat, Loretta glanced around the table, her eyes pausing briefly on Harrison before she joined in the conversation beside her. Martha leaned in to share a story about the bakery with Abigail, who laughed and promised to stop by for pecan rolls before the holiday season was over. Even Mr. Whitmore, a little stiff at first, began to relax, adding a comment here and there that drew chuckles from his side of the table. The estate for once sounded like a home. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation wrapped the dining room in a kind of music Harrison hadn't realized he'd missed. The chandelier's glow softened the faces around the table, catching on smiles, and on the rising steam from the platters passed from hand to hand. Abigail leaned over to refill Martha's glass, laughing at something Loretta had just said about the first time she'd ever tried to make cornbread on her own. Mr. Whitmore, still a little awkward, but clearly trying, asked after the bakery's holiday menu. Loretta answered kindly, mentioning the pecan tarts they made every December, and even inviting him to stop by. Harrison took it all in without speaking, letting the warmth of the scene settle deep into him. It was more than just the food or the light. It was the way people leaned toward each other, the genuine interest in their eyes. This was what Evelyn had always wanted the house to be, a place where people felt welcome, where kindness was the unspoken rule. He glanced toward the sideboard, where a leather-bound folder rested, brought in earlier from his study. His fingers tapped lightly on the table's edge as he considered the timing. The right moment was close. He could feel it in the way the evening had opened up in the quiet space between laughter and the next story. Setting down his fork, Harrison stood. The movement drew the room's attention almost instantly. He rested one hand on the back of his chair and let his gaze sweep the table. I have one more thing to say tonight, he began. His voice was steady but warmer than it had been in years. Over the last 2 days, I've been reminded of something Evelyn used to tell me. That trust isn't given lightly, but when it's earned, it changes everything. Loretta's eyes met his across the table. He stepped toward the sideboard, picked up the folder, and returned to stand at his place. This house, this table, they're part of what Evelyn built, but so was the Winters Trust Foundation. It's been sitting dormant because I couldn't find the right person to carry it forward. Until now. He placed the folder on the table in front of Loretta. The rich brown leather caught the candlelight as he slid it toward her. This makes it official, he said. You are now the executive director of the Evelyn Cole Trust. A hush fell over the table for a moment, broken only by the faint crackle of a candle wick. Loretta's hands hovered above the folder before she opened it, her eyes scanning the neatly typed papers inside. Her breath caught, not with hesitation, but with the weight of what she was being given. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice low. You've already said it, Harrison replied. In everything you've done since you walked through those gates. Around the table, heads nodded. Abigail with a quiet smile, Martha with tears brimming in her eyes, and even Mr. Whitmore with a look that mixed respect with something like regret. Loretta closed the folder gently, her hands resting on it as if grounding herself. Then I'll do my best to honor it. And her. The turkey had been carved down to its last slices, the bowls of greens nearly empty, and the cornbread basket left with only a few golden crumbs. Conversation softened into the gentle ebb of a meal, well-enjoyed laughter tapering to contented sighs. Abigail rose to clear a few dishes, but Harrison waved her off with a faint smile. Leave it for now. Tonight's not about tidying up before the moment's over. Martha chuckled at that, leaning back in her chair with the satisfied look of someone who'd eaten just enough. Well, that's a first for me, being told not to help clean. Loretta excused herself briefly to bring dessert from the sideboard. She returned carrying the pecan pie, its glossy surface catching the chandelier's light, the scent of caramelized sugar and toasted nuts trailing behind her. A smaller plate held a neat stack of dessert forks. "Who's saving room?" she asked, setting the pie down in the center of the table. Even Mr. Whitmore raised his hand, earning a ripple of good-natured laughter. Abigail sliced the pie, passing plates down the line, the fork tines glinting in the soft light. Soon the rich sweetness of the first bites spread through the table, drawing murmurs of approval. Harrison didn't rush his portion. He lingered over it, listening to the easy conversation between Martha and Abigail about holiday plans, and to Mr. Whitmore telling a surprisingly funny story about the time he'd been locked out of the post office on Christmas Eve. When Loretta glanced up from her own plate, she found Harrison's eyes on her. The look was steady, quiet, and without the guarded edge it once carried. It was the kind of look that said more than any toast or document could, that acknowledged the trust built between them and the understanding that it was meant to last. She held his gaze for a moment, a small smile passing between them before they both returned to the rhythm of the table. Outside, the night had deepened into a clear, crisp November darkness. Through the tall windows, the glow of the dining room spilled onto the lawn, casting soft shapes onto the fallen leaves. The hum of voices carried faintly to the porch, where a neighbor walking his dog slowed to listen. From the street, the Cole estate no longer seemed like the shuttered, silent place it had been. Light filled its windows, and the warm sound of people together, sharing stories, food, and the unspoken grace of mutual respect rolled outward into the cool night. For the first time in years, the estate felt alive. Through an open door and a table once left in silence, the Cole estate found its voice again. Warm laughter spilling into the night, carrying the echo of trust regained. Harrison's guarded heart had met Loretta's quiet strength, and together they proved that compassion often hides in plain sight, waiting for a chance to step forward. In a world quick to judge, they showed that true worth is revealed not by appearances, but by the choices we make when no one is watching. Kindness once given freely has a way of circling back, sometimes years later, in the most unexpected of meetings. And perhaps tonight, somewhere in your own life, there's a door worth opening to let the light in.